Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonas, and I'm a current Master of Energy Management student at ESCP. I believe that energy and environmental policy, if done correctly, can greatly enhance the transition towards a greener economy. And that is why I will try to focus a bit on the hope part of today's theme. And especially, I want to talk about carbon trading under the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 and aims at limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. It was adopted at COP21 in Paris, but funnily enough, final decisions on some parts of it, and that includes the infamous Article 6, hadn't been reached up until recently at COP26 in Glasgow. Some of you might have heard or read about COP26. There were some disagreements about terminology, whether coal should be phased down or phased out. You might also have heard about some decisions to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate change mitigation finance per year. But I feel like the final decision on the so-called rule book of the Paris Agreement did not get as much attention. The rulebook sets out guidelines for reporting emissions, but it also finalized mechanisms and standards for the two international carbon markets that are part of the Paris Agreement. Every country that has adopted the Paris Agreement sets itself a greenhouse gas reduction target. These are the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Now let's have a look at some of these NDCs. The US, as we can see, has a reduction target of minus 50 to 52% by 2030 compared to 2005. The EU has a target of minus 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. Brazil has a target of minus 37% by 2025 compared to 2005 levels. And lastly, Australia has a target of minus 26 to 28% by 2030 compared to 2005. So this was just to illustrate that every country decides on its own how ambitious it wants to be and what reference year it wants to use. Now, let's go back to the carbon markets. Under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, the first carbon market allows countries to voluntarily trade greenhouse gas reductions amongst each other. A country that has overachieved its climate pledge, or its NDC, can sell the extra emission reduction to another country that which can then use that overachievement from that other country to reach its own climate target. Now, how does it work in practice? BAU, here on the left, refers to business as usual as the business as usual scenario, which assumes that there are no significant changes in people's attitudes, no major changes in technology, economics, or politics. So basically, normal circumstances are expected to continue unchanged. ITMO are internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And as we can see, country A's emission target was 80, which means that in this example, its nationally determined contribution was minus 20%. However, country A overachieved its target and managed to reduce emissions by 50%. The overachievement in this case, the 30 percentage points difference, can be sold to country B, which did not achieve its emission reduction target. Country B managed to reduce its emissions by 10, but is still lacking 30 to reach its target of 70, so it can buy country A's overachievement. All of this happens under bilateral agreements, with the price of ITMOs being determined in the negotiations between countries. Currently, Switzerland is the only country that buys ITMOs. Now, why is all of this a good idea? Why is trading emission reductions a good idea? Trading emissions reductions allows for economically efficient greenhouse gas reductions. Why is that? That is because emission reductions will occur where the abatement cost or the cost of reduction for 1 unit of emission is lowest. Due to lax environmental laws and regulation, abating emissions in developing countries is often cheaper than abating the same amount of emission in developed countries where, thanks to tight regulations, the easy gains have already been implemented or realized. So let's take the example of landfills. The more organic content a landfill has, the more methane it produces. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It can be up to 25 times as harmful as CO2. So sealing a landfill, capturing and then burning the methane, which prevents it from entering the atmosphere, is a very cost-effective method of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Laws and regulations for doing this are in place in most developed nations, but not in many developing countries. So there are still some easy gains to be realized there. Said bluntly, it's all about investing the dollar where it has the largest greenhouse gas reduction impact. Utilizing this cost-effective mechanism could either dramatically reduce the cost of achieving a given emission reduction target, or alternatively, we could reach a more ambitious target with the initial cost. The International Emissions Trading Association, for example, found that carbon trading under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement could potentially reduce the cost of implementing NDCs by more than half, which corresponds to $250 billion annually in 2030. Or, alternatively, Article 6 could facilitate the removal of an additional 50% of emissions, which corresponds to 5 gigatons of CO2 per year at no additional cost. 5 gigatons are 5 billion tons, and just to give you a reference, the UK emitted about 365 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2019. Now, that is all for Article 6.2. Under Article 6.4, the second mechanism creates a carbon market where emissions reductions from either states or private entities can be traded, and which will be governed by a UN body. Under this mechanism, also private emission reductions can be bought by countries to meet their NDCs, as long as these emission reductions are certified. Yeah, this market has been implemented, but no transactions have yet taken place. Now, beyond this basic concept of carbon trading, the Paris Agreement states some conditions which the two carbon markets have to meet. The first one is that they must raise ambition in mitigation action and achieve an overall mitigation effect. During COP26, parties decided that 2% of the officially authorized and traded emission reduction credits will be cancelled. So, for example, if a country buys 100 ITMOs to be counted against its own reduction target, it can only claim 98 of those ITMOs. This will achieve an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and not just a shift from one country to another. The second condition is that double counting of emission reductions must be avoided. Double counting occurs when both the country where the emission reduction takes place, which is the host country, and the country that buys the reduction certificate claim to have avoided or reduced greenhouse gas emissions. COP26 decided that the host country that generates a credit through carbon emission reductions will decide whether to authorize it for sale to another country or count it to their own climate targets. If the country authorizes the selling of a credit, it will add 1 unit of CO2 equivalent to its own national carbon emission, and the buyer country will deduct the same unit of CO2 equivalent. This process is known as corresponding adjustment and ensures that emission reductions are only counted once when traded between countries. Let's have another look at the figure. Country A's sale of ITMOs will be added back to its own emission, which we can see here as the adjusted emissions. Of course, this happens only on an accounting basis and not literally. Country B's emission will be reduced by the amount of ITMOs it buys, again, only on an accounting basis. The third condition is that part of the money generated under the market outlined under Article 6.4, which is the market where private entities can participate, must be channeled to its adaptation funding in developing countries. This condition has been met with the agreement that 5% of the proceeds of that market are funneled into the UN Adaptation Fund, which finances climate change adaptation projects in developing countries. Now, are there some not so rosy aspects to this carbon market, or rather the decisions on it? Well, unfortunately, yes. Firstly, some old offset credits that were generated under the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM, can be carried over and traded in the new markets. The CDM was established under the Kyoto Protocol, and it was one of the first carbon markets ever. It generated carbon offset credits that arose from emission reduction projects in developing countries. However, the quality and environmental integrity of these CDM credits are very contentious. A 2016 study questioned the non-overestimation of emission reductions of up to 85% of all issued carbon offset credits under the CDM between 2013 and 2020. So, in a nutshell, there are serious doubts over whether many of these credits have actually ever driven real emission cuts. Countries that initially said they wanted to use these low-quality credits in the new carbon market include Australia, Brazil, and India. However, thanks to international criticism, Australia has abandoned those plans in 2020. The number of these low-quality offset credits that can be carried over into the new markets is not known exactly, but estimates put it anywhere between 120 and 300 million credits, whereby every credit represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. The second issue is that there is a general problem with ambitious NDCs and emission reduction trading. Every country, as we've seen earlier, decides how ambitious it wants to be regarding its NDCs. Now, if we look at the figure again, we see that both countries have an incentive to set themselves unambitious NDCs. If country A's emission target was 90 instead of 80, it could sell 10 more ITMOs. Similarly, if country B's emission target was 80 instead of 70, it would have to buy 10 ITMOs less to reach its target. So overall, most decisions on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement were positive, and if more countries can be persuaded to use or to not use CDM carryovers, large amounts of the potential $250 billion in savings per year, thanks to carbon markets and their economic efficiency, can still be realized. Thank you.